A trip to remember. The weekend finally arrived, bringing with it the warm anticipation of a family adventure. For the Johnsons, it was a day they had been looking forward to all week. The plan was simple yet exciting. A day at the zoo. The sky was a brilliant shade of blue, the sun casting a comforting warmth over the city. 8-year-old Ava Johnson was buzzing with excitement, gripping her parents' hands as they made their way up the zoo's stone-paved entrance. Her eyes sparkled with eagerness as she chatted nonstop about the animals she wanted to see. Mark and Lisa, her parents, exchanged warm smiles. They adored seeing Ava so animated and full of joy. They'd worked hard to plan this day, to give her an unforgettable experience with the creatures she'd only seen in her books or on the television screen. From the start, however, there was an odd undercurrent in the air. As they approached the ticket counter, the man behind the glass barely looked at them. He mumbled something under his breath, handing over the tickets with a disinterested glance that left Lisa feeling uneasy. She told herself it was just a busy day at the zoo, rushing off the strange exchange. Once inside, they dove right into the exhibits. Ava was completely captivated, darting from one enclosure to another, her face lighting up at every new animal she encountered. The towering giraffes with their graceful necks, the playful monkeys swinging between branches, and the slow-moving elephants plodding through their terrain were a marvel to her. Ava's excitement was so contagious that Mark and Lisa quickly forgot the minor discomfort at the entrance. But as they continued exploring, the feeling that something wasn't quite right returned. They noticed glances from other zoogoers, some curious, some judgmental. A few employees seemed to watch them a little too closely, their gazes holding an uncomfortable intensity. Mark and Lisa exchanged nervous glances, but decided not to let it ruin their day. They focused instead on Ava's laughter and her endless questions about the animals. After visiting nearly every exhibit, Ava still brimmed with energy. She held a crumpled zoo map in her hands, tracing her finger over the winding paths with an air of purpose. "Mom, Dad," she called out, her eyes shining with excitement. "We haven't seen the bears yet. Can we go?" Mark and Lisa looked at each other, amused by her boundless enthusiasm. They couldn't deny her that request. "Of course, sweetheart," Mark said, taking her hand again. They followed the winding trail leading to the bear enclosure, nestled in a quieter part of the zoo away from the hustle and bustle of the main areas. It was the perfect end to an already remarkable day. The bear enclosure was grand and intimidating, with high walls and thick glass that provided a safe barrier between the visitors and the powerful animals within. Large rocks and trees were scattered throughout, providing an environment that mimicked the bear's natural habitat. Ava's eyes grew wide as she pressed her hands against the glass, watching in awe as a large grizzly bear lumbered along the rocks, sniffing the air with its keen nose. It was a breathtaking sight, and Ava was completely transfixed. Lisa and Mark stood a few steps back, momentarily distracted as they discussed whether they should buy Ava a souvenir from the gift shop. Lost in conversation, they didn't notice as Ava, eager to get a closer look, inched closer to the railing. A sudden voice interrupted their peaceful moment. "Well, well, look who we have here," the voice sneered. Mark and Lisa turned quickly, scanning the area for Ava, only to find a man in a zoo uniform standing just a few feet from her. He was older, with a hard expression etched into his face and a chilling glint in his eyes. He seemed to exude a subtle but unmistakable disdain as he looked down at their daughter. "Excuse me," Mark called out, his voice hesitant as he took a step forward, but the man didn't respond. Instead, he leaned down toward Ava, his face twisting into a sneer. Ava looked up at him, her smile fading as confusion and unease clouded her expression. Mark and Lisa were frozen, watching this strange interaction unfold, uncertain whether to intervene or give the man the benefit of the doubt. They held back for only a moment, but that moment would haunt them. Ava shifted uncomfortably, glancing back at her parents, but before she could say anything, the man grabbed her shoulder. Ava instinctively tried to pull away, but his grip was firm, his fingers pressing painfully into her shoulder. Mark's heart dropped as he realized the man wasn't just some well-meaning staff member. There was something sinister in his gaze, something malevolent. And then, before anyone could react, the man gave Ava a hard shove. The force sent her stumbling backward, her small arms flailing as she lost her balance. The world seemed to slow as she tumbled over the edge of the railing, her terrified scream piercing the air as she fell into the bare enclosure below. Lisa's scream echoed her daughter's, and Mark sprang forward, his heart racing with terror. "Ava," he shouted, his voice breaking as he rushed to the railing, his eyes fixed on the spot where his little girl had disappeared. For a few agonizing seconds, there was nothing but silence. Then he saw her, a tiny figure lying crumpled on the ground inside the enclosure. The grizzly bear, hearing the commotion, turned its massive head in her direction, its dark eyes locking onto Ava with a predatory curiosity. People began to gather, drawn by the sudden commotion. Some pulled out their phones to record, while others screamed for help. But no one seemed to know what to do. Panic had seized them all. Mark didn't waste another second. Ignoring the murmurs and shouts around him, he hoisted himself onto the railing, ready to jump in after his daughter. As he looked down into the enclosure, he locked eyes with the man who had shoved her, an indifferent gaze meeting his terrified one. The man's lips curled into a twisted smile, and Mark felt a surge of rage and helplessness. Without another thought, he leaped down into the enclosure, his only focus on reaching his daughter before the bear could. As he landed, a sharp pain shot up his leg, but he ignored it, scrambling to his feet and running toward Ava, who was beginning to stir. The bear, sensing new movement, shifted its attention from Ava to Mark. It took a few slow steps toward them, its immense size and strength evident in every heavy footfall. Mark's heart pounded as he reached Ava, pulling her into his arms and shielding her with his own body. "Daddy?" Ava whispered, her voice shaking as she clung to him. "Is it going to hurt us?" Mark held her tightly, trying to hide his fear. "No, baby," he murmured, his voice steady despite his terror. "I'm here. I won't let anything happen to you." The bear was only a few feet away now, its deep eyes studying them with an unsettling focus. The crowd above gasped, their faces pale as they watched the scene unfold. Somewhere in the back of his mind, Mark knew that help would come, that someone would find a way to get them out. But at that moment, all he had was his resolve, his promise to protect his daughter no matter what. And as the bear took another step closer, that promise became the only thing keeping him from being consumed by fear. He braced himself, ready to do whatever it took to keep Ava safe, even if it meant facing down the most terrifying creature he had ever encountered. A father's promise. Mark could feel every beat of his heart hammering in his chest as he held Ava close, keeping his body between her and the grizzly bear inching closer. The bear's gaze was locked on them, its powerful muscles rippling under its dense brown fur as it moved with an unnerving calm, the curiosity in its eyes mixed with something darker. Mark's hands shook, but he forced himself to stay steady. He couldn't let Ava see his fear. She needed him to be her rock, her protector. Up above, the crowd continued to grow, their horrified whispers and gasps filling the air. The bear's enclosure, usually a place of fascination and awe, had become the stage for a nightmare. People were frantically calling for help, but no one dared jump in to aid the father and daughter cornered by the massive beast. Phones were raised, cameras clicked, but they all seemed powerless, watching in helpless silence. "Daddy?" Ava's small voice trembled as she clutched at his shirt, her wide eyes glancing fearfully at the bear. "Why is it looking at us like that?" Mark forced a reassuring smile. "It's okay, sweetie," he whispered, trying to keep his voice calm. "We're going to be fine. Just stay close to me, all right?" Ava nodded, though her tiny hands clung to him even tighter. The warmth of her grip reminded him of his reason for being there, of the love that drove him to do whatever it took to keep her safe. He would face 1,000 grizzly bears if it meant saving her. The bear took another step forward, its eyes narrowing as it sniffed the air, catching their scent. Mark felt a surge of panic rise in his throat, but he quickly swallowed it down. He had to think of something. His gaze darted around the enclosure, searching for anything he could use to defend them, anything that might distract the bear even for a moment. Suddenly, a voice cut through the tension. A low, mocking chuckle from the edge of the enclosure. Mark looked up, his stomach twisting as he saw the man who had shoved Ava standing just beyond the railing, his arms folded, watching with a look of smug satisfaction. "Well, aren't you the hero?" The man sneered, his voice carrying a twisted amusement. "Do you think you're actually going to get out of there alive?" Mark's jaw tightened, fury boiling inside him. He wanted nothing more than to climb out of the enclosure and confront this man, to demand an answer for why he had done such a horrific thing. But there was no time. Every second spent focusing on the man was a second wasted, a second that brought the bear closer to him and Ava. "Why are you doing this?" Mark shouted, his voice filled with a mixture of anger and desperation. What kind of person pushes a child into an animal enclosure? The man's smile only widened, his gaze cold and unfeeling. "You don't belong here," he spat, his tone dripping with disdain. "People like you think you can just waltz in, taking up space that's not yours to take. Maybe now you'll learn your place." Mark's mind reeled at the words, the sheer cruelty of the man's intent sinking in. But he didn't have the luxury of processing it, not when Ava's life was on the line. He refocused on the bear, its lumbering form now only a few feet away. He could see its muscles tense, its massive paws digging into the ground as it prepared to close the distance. "Listen to me, Ava," Mark whispered urgently, keeping his voice as steady as possible. "I need you to be very brave right now. When I said run, I want you to run to the other side of the enclosure, right over there, okay?" "But Daddy," Ava's voice quivered, her eyes filling with tears. "What about you?" Mark gave her a gentle squeeze. "Don't worry about me, sweetheart. Just focus on getting to the other side. I'll be right behind you, I promise." The bear let out a low growl, its dark eyes flickering with intensity as it took another step forward. Mark's heart raced. He knew that facing down an animal of this size was almost impossible. It was stronger, faster, and could end them both with a single swipe of its massive paw. But he couldn't let that stop him. "Now, Ava," he shouted, giving her a gentle push. "Run." Ava's feet barely touched the ground as she bolted across the enclosure, her small figure darting through the rocky terrain, making her way to the opposite side. The bear's head whipped around, its gaze shifting from Mark to Ava, drawn by her movement. Without thinking, Mark picked up a handful of small rocks scattered across the ground, hurling them at the bear to draw its attention back to him. "Over here," he shouted, his voice filled with desperation. "Come on, leave her alone." The bear let out a frustrated snort, swiping its massive paw in his direction. The rocks did little to hurt it, but the motion seemed to catch its interest. It took a lumbering step towards him, its eyes narrowing with a predatory focus. Mark took a shaky step back, keeping his gaze locked on the bear, trying to anticipate its every move. His heart hammered in his chest, but he knew he couldn't afford to let his fear show. Ava was watching, and she needed to believe he was strong. Suddenly, a voice from above shouted, "Zoo security is on the way." Mark glanced up to see a man in a zoo uniform, pushing his way through the crowd, his face set in determination. Relief flooded through him, but it was tempered by the realization that help might not arrive in time. He needed to buy a few more seconds, just enough time for security to reach them. "Daddy," Ava called, her voice small and terrified from the other side of the enclosure. "Please be careful." Mark glanced over at her, giving her a reassuring smile he didn't quite feel. "I'll be fine, sweetheart," he called back. "Just stay where you are." The bear took another step toward him, its massive frame casting a long shadow across the enclosure. Mark's hands shook as he reached for another handful of rocks, preparing to throw them when, suddenly, he heard a shrill whistle from above. It was one of the security guards, blowing a loud, high-pitched whistle to get the bear's attention. The bear froze, its ears perking up at the noise. It turned its head, distracted by the sound, giving Mark the briefest of openings. Without wasting a second, Mark sprinted towards Ava, his legs burning as he crossed the enclosure as fast as he could. The bear, momentarily disoriented by the whistle, was now turning back toward them, but the delay had given Mark just enough time. He reached Ava, scooping her up into his arms as he looked for a way out. His eyes landed on a low section of the fence near the edge of the enclosure where the crowd had gathered, their faces pale with fear and anticipation. With every ounce of strength he had left, Mark hoisted Ava onto his shoulders, urging her to climb. "Go, Ava. Climb over and get to safety," he shouted, his voice filled with desperation. Ava's small hands gripped the fence, her face twisted in fear as she began to climb. Mark held his breath, his heart pounding as he watched her inch her way up, higher and higher. But as she neared the top, the bear let out a furious roar, charging toward them with renewed aggression. Mark didn't think. He threw himself in front of the bear, his arms spread wide as he tried to block its path. He could feel the animal's hot breath, the weight of its presence bearing down on him, but he stood his ground. If this was what it took to protect Ava, he was ready. Just as the bear was about to reach him, another whistle sounded, this time accompanied by a loud, piercing siren. The bear hesitated, glancing toward the source of the noise, giving Mark a brief reprieve. He took the chance to push himself back, stumbling away from the bear and closer to the fence. "Dad." Ava's voice was desperate as she reached the top of the fence, her hands clutching the edge as she prepared to jump to the other side. "Go, Ava," Mark shouted, his voice breaking. "I'm right behind you." Ava hesitated for a split second, her eyes wide with fear and worry, but then she nodded, scrambling over the fence and landing safely on the other side. Mark's heart swelled with relief as he watched her reach safety, her small figure enveloped in the arms of zoo security. But he wasn't out yet. The bear, realizing its prey was slipping away, lunged forward with a furious growl. Mark barely had time to react as he threw himself towards the fence, grabbing hold of it and beginning to climb, his muscles straining with every inch. Just as he reached the top, the bear's massive paw swiped at him, claws grazing his leg and tearing through his pants. Pain shot through him, but he didn't let go. With a final burst of energy, he hoisted himself over the fence, collapsing onto the ground on the other side, gasping for breath. Ava was beside him in an instant, wrapping her arms around him as tears streamed down her face. "Daddy, you're okay," she sobbed, clinging to him as if she'd never let go. Mark held her tightly, his own tears mixing with hers as he whispered soothing words, assuring her they were safe. Around them, the crowd erupted in relieved cheers, the tension finally breaking as security guards moved to contain the bear. But as Mark looked up, his gaze landed on the man who had started it all. The same cold, smug expression lingered on his face, his eyes gleaming with twisted satisfaction. The sight of him filled Mark with a surge of fury. He knew this wasn't over, not until the man faced the consequences of his actions. The crowd might have cheered, but Mark's fight was far from finished, and with Ava safe in his arms, he knew he had the strength to see it through. Confronting the darkness, Mark's body ached with the aftershocks of adrenaline, his muscles tense from the ordeal. He held Ava tightly, her small frame curled into his, as if she feared that letting go might cause them to slip back into the nightmare they had just escaped. Zoo security hovered around them, offering words of reassurance, but Mark barely registered their presence. His gaze was fixed on one person, the man who had pushed his daughter into that bare enclosure, the one who had stood there with a cruel, satisfied smirk, as if watching some twisted spectacle. The man hadn't moved, his smug expression still plastered across his face. Even now, with the commotion dying down, and the onlookers dispersing, he didn't seem afraid, nor did he show any remorse. If anything, he appeared pleased with himself, his eyes gleaming with twisted amusement. "Stay here with the guard, Ava," Mark murmured, gently releasing her. His voice was calm, but Ava could hear the underlying steel in his tone. She clung to him for a moment longer, then reluctantly let go, sensing that her father needed to do this. She nodded, her face pale but resolute, as a zoo security guard moved closer to her, offering reassurance. Mark rose slowly, his muscles stiff, and walked towards the man, his gaze unwavering. A strange calm settled over him, as if all the fear, anger, and panic he had felt before had solidified into an unbreakable resolve. He wasn't going to let this go unpunished. "Why?" Mark's voice was low, but it cut through the air like a blade, slicing through the murmurs of the crowd. He stood inches away from the man, his fists clenched at his sides. "Why would you do something like that? What kind of person pushes a child into harm's way?" The man met Mark's gaze, his smirk unfaltering. "People like you don't belong here," he sneered, his tone dripping with contempt. "Thinking you can walk into any space, take up room like you own it. Maybe now you'll understand there are places you're not welcome." Mark's jaw tightened, a fiery anger simmering beneath his skin. "You're sick," he hissed. "My daughter, an innocent little girl, could have been killed, and you just stood there, watching, as if it was some kind of show." The man shrugged, his gaze cold. "She's just one kid. A lesson, that's all. A lesson to people who think they can go anywhere and act like they're untouchable." His tone was casual, as if he were discussing something as trivial as a parking violation. Mark took a step closer, his body tense, fists trembling with the need to strike this man, to make him feel even a fraction of the terror Avad had experienced. But before he could act, he felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see a zoo security guard, his expression stern. "Sir, we'll take it from here," the guard said, his tone firm. He looked at the man with a disapproving glare. "We've already called the police. They're on their way." The man's smirk faltered slightly at the mention of the police, but he quickly recovered, a defiant glint in his eyes. "What are they going to do?" "I didn't break any laws," he sneered. "She fell. That's all. Prove otherwise." Mark's gaze hardened. "There are dozens of witnesses who saw what you did," he replied, his voice steady. "And I'll make sure every single one of them is willing to testify." The man's smirk finally faded, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. He took a step back, his gaze darting around as if searching for an escape route. But the crowd had closed in, their faces filled with outrage and disgust. Murmurs of agreement echoed through the gathering, people nodding and pointing at the man, their collective condemnation pressing in on him from all sides. "Coward!" someone shouted from the crowd. "How could you do that to a child?" "Monster!" another voice called out, the word carrying a wave of anger that seemed to ripple through the crowd. The man's face paled, his confidence crumbling under the weight of the crowd's outrage. He glanced around, his defiant expression faltering as he realized he was cornered. There was no escape from the consequences of his actions. Within moments, the distant wail of sirens grew louder, cutting through the tension. 2 police officers appeared, pushing their way through the crowd, their faces set with grim determination. The man's defiance melted entirely, replaced by a flicker of fear as the officers approached. "What's going on here?" one of the officers asked, his gaze shifting from Mark to the man, who now looked as though he wished he could disappear. Mark straightened, stepping forward. "This man pushed my daughter into the bare enclosure," he said, his voice steady but filled with a simmering anger. "She could have been killed." The officer's face hardened as he looked at the man, his gaze filled with a mixture of disbelief and disgust. "Is this true?" he asked, his tone cold. The man stammered, his earlier confidence completely shattered. She was too close to the edge," he muttered, his voice trembling. I was trying to keep her from leaning too far over." Mark clenched his fists, struggling to contain his anger. "That's a lie," he snapped. "You shoved her. And you watched as she fell, as if it was some twisted form of entertainment." The officer nodded, his expression darkening. "We have witnesses, and we'll be reviewing the zoo's security footage," he said. He turned to the man, his tone sharp. "Sir, you're under arrest. You have the right to remain silent." The man's face drained of color as the officer read him his rights, his shoulders slumping as he was handcuffed. He cast one last, defiant glare at Mark, but Mark didn't flinch. He met the man's gaze with a steely resolve, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing any weakness. As the officers led the man away, Mark felt a strange mixture of relief and lingering anger. Justice was being served, but the weight of what had happened, the danger his daughter had been in, settled over him like a heavy fog. He turned back to Ava, who was still standing with the security guard, her eyes wide and filled with confusion. Mark walked over to her, his heart aching as he saw the fear and uncertainty etched into her young face. He knelt down, reaching out to take her hands in his voice soft. "It's over, sweetheart," he murmured. "You're safe now. That man won't hurt anyone ever again." Ava looked up at him, her lips quivering as she tried to process everything that had happened. "Daddy, why did he do that? I didn't do anything wrong." Mark's heart broke at her words, his anger giving way to a deep sadness. He pulled her into his arms, holding her close as he whispered, "You didn't do anything wrong, Ava. Some people are just. They're not good inside. But you're safe now. I promise." Ava buried her face in his shoulder, her small body trembling as the weight of the ordeal settled over her. Mark held her, feeling the tension in her body slowly fade as she clung to him, drawing comfort from his presence. He wished he could erase the memory of that terrible moment, to take away the fear and replace it with the innocence she'd had just hours before. Lisa joined them, her face streaked with tears as she wrapped her arms around both of them. They stayed that way for a long moment, a family reunited in the wake of horror, bound together by their love and resilience. Eventually, they rose, making their way out of the zoo, away from the whispers and stares of onlookers. They walked in silence, each of them lost in their thoughts, the weight of the experience lingering in the air between them. But as they reached the car, Ava looked up at her parents, a hint of her usual spark returning to her eyes. "Can we go home now?" she asked, her voice small but steady. Mark and Lisa exchanged a glance, a flicker of relief passing between them. "Yes, sweetheart," Lisa replied, her voice soft. "Let's go home." As they drove away from the zoo, Mark glanced in the rearview mirror, watching Ava as she gazed out the window, her face thoughtful. He knew the day's events would linger with her, but he also knew that they had something stronger than fear. The unbreakable bond of family, a love that would guide them through even the darkest moments. Mark's hands tightened on the steering wheel, a newfound determination settling over him. They had survived something terrible, something unimaginable. And as long as they had each other, they could face whatever the world threw their way. The aftermath of shadows. The drive home from the zoo was silent. Mark and Lisa exchanged glances now and then, 1,000 unspoken words between them. Ava, sitting quietly in the back seat, looked out the window, her small face drawn and pale. Mark's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his mind replaying the nightmare over and over. The fall, the bear, the man's twisted smile. He could feel the weight of it all pressing down on him, as if they'd barely escaped with their lives. When they finally pulled into the driveway, Ava looked up, blinking as if she was just realizing they were home. Mark turned off the engine, glancing over his shoulder. "We're here, sweetheart," he said softly. Ava nodded but didn't move right away, her gaze fixed on her lap. Lisa reached back, gently brushing her daughter's hair. "Ava, honey, we're safe now," she whispered, her voice filled with the gentle reassurance that only a mother could offer. "Why don't we go inside? Maybe make some hot cocoa." The suggestion brought a faint smile to Ava's face, and she nodded again. Slowly, she climbed out of the car, holding tightly to her mother's hand as they walked toward the house. Mark followed closely, feeling a surge of gratitude for the familiar walls, the safety that their home represented. He didn't know how to begin healing the wounds that had been left on his family, but he knew that home was the best place to start. Once inside, they all settled into the living room. Ava sat curled up on the couch, wrapped in a soft blanket, while Mark and Lisa moved around the kitchen, making her favorite hot cocoa with extra marshmallows. As they waited for the milk to heat up, Lisa turned to Mark, her voice barely above a whisper. "What are we going to do, Mark?" she asked, her eyes filled with worry. "She's so young. She shouldn't have to deal with something like this." Mark's jaw tightened, a wave of helplessness washing over him. "I know," he replied, his voice rough. "I don't have all the answers. But we're going to be there for her, every step of the way. We'll get through this together." Lisa nodded, her hand reaching for his. They shared a moment of silent understanding before the milk began to boil over, pulling them back to the present. Mark quickly took it off the stove, pouring the steaming liquid into a mug and adding marshmallows on top, just the way Ava liked it. They carried the mug to her, Lisa sitting down beside her, while Mark settled into the armchair across from them. Ava took a sip, her small hands cradling the mug as if it were a lifeline. She stared down into the cocoa, her brow furrowed in thought. After a long moment, she looked up, her eyes meeting her parents'. "Mom, Dad," she began, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Why did that man do that? Why did he push me?" Mark and Lisa exchanged a glance, neither one sure how to answer. They had anticipated this question, but hearing it out loud, hearing the hurt in Ava's voice, made it all the more painful. Mark leaned forward, choosing his words carefully. "Sweetheart," he began, his voice gentle. "Sometimes people do bad things, and sometimes they don't even have a good reason. That man didn't know you. He didn't know anything about how kind and special you are." Ava looked down at her mug, her brow knitting together. "But I didn't do anything wrong. I was just looking at the bear." Lisa's heart broke at the words, and she reached out, pulling her daughter into a gentle embrace. "You're right, honey. You didn't do anything wrong. You're wonderful just the way you are, and what happened today wasn't your fault. That man, he was wrong, and he's going to have to answer for what he did." Ava nodded, leaning into her mother's embrace, but the sadness in her eyes didn't disappear. Mark watched them, his heart aching for his daughter. He knew that no amount of comforting words could erase what she had experienced. He would have given anything to shield her from the memory of it, but he knew that wasn't possible. All he could do now was be there for her, to remind her every day that she was loved and that she was safe. Over the next few days, they tried to return to their routine, but the experience at the zoo lingered like a shadow. Ava was quieter than usual, her once bright and bubbly personality subdued. She spent hours alone in her room, reading her animal encyclopedia but avoiding the pages that showed bears. At night, she had trouble sleeping, and more than once, Mark and Lisa woke to find her standing by their bed, her small face pale and frightened. One night, after tucking her in, Mark lingered by the door, watching her as she drifted off to sleep. As he turned to leave, he heard her small voice call out to him. "Daddy," she whispered, her eyes wide in the dim light. "Will I ever feel safe again?" Mark felt a lump form in his throat, but he forced himself to smile. "Yes, sweetheart," he replied, his voice steady. "One day, you'll feel safe again. And until that day comes, I'm going to be right here, protecting you." Ava nodded, her eyes drifting shut as she clutched her stuffed giraffe. Mark watched her for a long moment, a fierce resolve hardening within him. He knew he couldn't change what had happened, but he could help her move forward. He would make sure that Ava's future was filled with love, joy, and all the happiness she deserved. The next morning, Mark and Lisa decided it was time to seek help. They reached out to a child psychologist, someone who specialized in trauma therapy for young children. They knew Ava needed more than just their reassurances. She needed someone who could help her process what she had been through, someone who could guide her on the path to healing. At their first session, the psychologist, Dr. Harper, greeted Ava with a warm smile, her office filled with soft colors and shelves, lined with stuffed animals and picture books. Ava was hesitant at first, clinging to Lisa's hand as they entered the room, but Dr. Harper's gentle manner soon put her at ease. As they settled into the session, Dr. Harper encouraged Ava to share her feelings, to talk about the things that scared her. At first, Ava was reluctant, her gaze fixed on the floor as she answered in short, quiet sentences. But as the session continued, she began to open up, talking about the bear, the man, and the way she had felt so small and helpless. Dr. Harper listened with patience and understanding, never rushing Ava, allowing her to set the pace. She introduced Ava to small exercises, drawing pictures, playing with animal figurines that helped her express her feelings in ways words couldn't capture. Ava took to the exercises, her small hands carefully arranging the animals, creating her own little world where she was in control. Mark and Lisa watched from the doorway, their hearts swelling with hope as they saw the first signs of healing in their daughter. They knew the road ahead would be long, but they were willing to walk it with her, one step at a time. Over the following weeks, Ava's nightmares became less frequent, and the spark in her eyes began to return. She still had moments of sadness, moments when the memory of that day would resurface, but she was learning to manage it, to reclaim her sense of safety. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Ava looked up at her parents, a small smile playing on her lips. "Mom, Dad," she said softly, "I think I want to go back to the zoo someday. Not now, but maybe one day." Mark felt a surge of pride, his heart swelling with admiration for his daughter's bravery. He reached out, taking her hand in his voice filled with warmth. "Whenever you're ready, sweetheart," he replied. "We'll be right there with you." And as they sat together, hand in hand, the Johnson family knew that they were stronger than any fear, stronger than any darkness. They had faced a nightmare and emerged on the other side, bound together by love, resilience, and the unbreakable bond of family. Steps toward healing. Weeks had passed since that day of the zoo, but the shadow of it lingered in small, quiet ways, woven into the daily life of the Johnson family. Each step forward had been both a victory and a reminder of the trauma they were trying to leave behind. Ava's resilience and courage amazed Mark and Lisa, yet they knew that such wounds, though unseen, could take time to heal completely. They remained vigilant, always ready to offer comfort, though they tried not to let the vigilance overshadow their lives. Dr. Harper had been a blessing, helping Ava express her feelings through art, storytelling, and play therapy. The sessions became a place where Ava could be honest about her fears, where she could confront the memory of the bear and the man who had pushed her without feeling alone. Each session brought a new layer of healing, but it was not without its challenges. Ava's fears didn't vanish all at once. They shifted, softened, but sometimes resurfaced. One day, after a particularly tearful session, Dr. Harper sat with Mark and Lisa alone, her expression gentle but serious. "Ava's making incredible progress," she began, her voice filled with admiration for the young girl. "She's strong, and she's beginning to feel safe again. But you might notice that she's still more cautious than before. That's normal. When children go through traumatic experiences, it changes the way they view the world. It takes time to rebuild that sense of safety." Mark nodded, his jaw clenched. He had watched Ava's bright confidence falter in small ways. How she hesitated when she used to run freely. How she clung a little tighter to their hands in crowded places. "What can we do to help her feel safe again?" Dr. Harper smiled. "Just keep doing what you're doing. Show her she's protected, that she has control over her environment. Empower her to make choices, no matter how small. And when she feels ready, let her take small steps back into the world. Maybe one day, she'll even want to visit a zoo again." but that has to be her choice. Lisa looked down, fighting back tears. She wanted nothing more than to erase the fear Ava carried with her, but she understood the importance of taking it slow. She knew that Ava would find her way back to that confidence in her own time. That weekend, they decided to do something special as a family. A day filled with light and laughter, far from the memories that haunted them. They drove to a nearby beach, one of Ava's favorite places. The gentle waves, the open sky, and the warm sun seemed to lift her spirits. As they walked along the shore, Ava reached for her parents' hands, a bright smile on her face. "Look, Daddy," she said, pointing at a sandcastle someone had built. "It's got towers and everything." Mark chuckled, squeezing her hand. "Pretty impressive, huh? Think we can make one even better?" Ava's eyes sparkled with excitement. "Yes, let's make it the tallest castle on the beach." They spent the next hour digging, stacking, and sculpting, Ava directing every detail with newfound confidence. The castle grew taller with each bucket of sand, and soon it was adorned with seashells, tiny flags made of twigs and leaves, and even a moat. Ava's laughter filled the air, echoing with a joy that felt almost like a miracle. As they stepped back to admire their work, a gentle breeze swept across the beach, brushing through Ava's hair. She looked up at her parents, her face glowing with pride. "We made the best castle ever," she declared, her voice filled with a mixture of awe and accomplishment. Mark and Lisa exchanged a glance, their hearts swelling with love and gratitude. In that moment, they saw glimpses of the old Ava, the fearless, curious, and bright little girl who had been momentarily hidden behind the trauma. She was still there, and with each passing day, she was finding her way back. As they packed up to leave, Ava lingered by the shoreline, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Mark watched her, sensing that something was on her mind. "You okay, sweetheart?" he asked, walking over and placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. Ava nodded, though her expression was thoughtful. "Daddy, do you think there are people out there who are still mean? Like that man?" Mark knelt down beside her, looking into her serious eyes. "Yes, honey," he said honestly. "There are some people in the world who are mean, who don't think about others' feelings, but there are also many, many good people, people who want to help, who care about others." Ava was quiet for a moment, processing his words. Do you think I'll ever be as brave as you and Mommy were?" Mark's heart swelled with pride and sadness all at once. "Ava, you're already braver than you know," he said gently. "It takes real courage to talk about what happened, to face your fears like you've been doing. And every day, you get even braver." Ava looked down, her cheeks flushing slightly. She thought about Dr. Harper, the drawing she'd made, and the conversations she'd had with her parents late at night. She was beginning to realize that bravery wasn't just about big, dramatic actions. It was about facing the small fears, the quiet moments of doubt, and still moving forward. On the way home, Ava sat quietly in the back seat, her gaze distant but peaceful. As they pulled into the driveway, she looked at her parents, a new determination in her eyes. "I want to visit the zoo again," she announced, her voice steady. Mark and Lisa exchanged a look, surprised but proud. "Are you sure, honey?" Lisa asked, her tone gentle. "We don't have to go if you're not ready." Ava nodded firmly. "I want to see the animals again. But this time, I want you and Daddy to stay close, okay?" Mark reached over, squeezing her hand. "Of course, sweetheart. We'll stay right by your side." The following weekend, they made the trip back to the zoo. As they walked up to the entrance, Mark could feel his own heart beating a little faster. The memory of that day was still vivid, and he fought the instinct to turn around, to shield Ava from the place that had brought them so much pain. But when he looked down at her, saw the determination in her eyes, he knew that she was ready. They moved through the zoo, visiting each exhibit at Ava's pace. She marveled at the giraffes again, laughed at the monkeys, and clapped with delight at the sight of the elephants. The day unfolded with quiet joy, a gentle rhythm of laughter and wonder that seemed to wash away the pain of the past. When they reached the bear enclosure, Ava hesitated, her small hand tightening around Mark's. She stared at the massive creatures moving behind the glass, her face a mixture of fascination and fear. Mark knelt beside her, his hand steady on her shoulder. "You don't have to do this if you're not ready, Ava," he said softly. Ava took a deep breath, her gaze never leaving the bears. "I'm okay, Daddy. I want to see them. They're kind of amazing, aren't they?" Mark smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "Yes, they are," he replied. "And so are you." They stayed by the bear enclosure for a few moments, watching the animals move with their slow, powerful grace. And as they stood there, Ava seemed to grow more at ease, her initial fear giving way to a quiet admiration for the creatures that had once terrified her. Later, as they made their way back to the car, Ava turned to her parents, a small smile playing on her lips. I think I'm not scared anymore," she said. "Not as much anyway." Mark and Lisa exchanged a look, their hearts filled with relief and pride. They knew the journey wasn't over, that there would be days when the memories would return, when the fear would resurface. But today had been a victory, a powerful step toward reclaiming the joy that had been taken from them. That evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Ava's laughter filled the room once again. The memory of that day at the zoo would always be with them, but it no longer held them captive. They had faced it, overcome it, and emerged stronger, bound together by love and resilience. In the quiet moments that followed, Mark looked at his family, a deep gratitude settling over him. They had weathered a storm, and though the scars remained, they were healing, together. And as they sat there, sharing stories and laughter, Mark knew one thing for certain. They were ready for whatever the future held, because they had each other. And that, he realized, was the greatest strength of all. A family reunited. The weeks that followed Ava's return to the zoo felt like a new beginning for the Johnson family. The ordeal that had shaken them had now become something they could look back on, no longer trapped in the shadow of fear, but rather as a testament to their resilience and unity. There were still moments when the memory of that terrifying day would surface unexpectedly, but each time they faced it together, drawing strength from one another. Ava's progress was profound. Her curiosity for animals had returned, a bit more cautious perhaps, but her love for them was undimmed. Her favorite stories had found their way back to her nighttime routine, and she would eagerly read aloud to her parents, explaining facts about animals in the same bright, animated tone they'd missed so much. Mark and Lisa often found themselves watching her, exchanging glances that spoke of deep gratitude. They had nearly lost this joy, this childlike wonder, but Ava had fought her way back to it, with courage that humbled them both. In the days that followed, Ava continued to blossom, her laughter filling the house once more. She played in the backyard, joined her parents for family movie nights, and even began planning her next visit to the zoo, though she insisted on skipping the bear enclosure. Mark and Lisa were happy to oblige, knowing that bravery took many forms, and that she would revisit that place only when she was truly ready. One weekend, Ava decided to hold a family play in the living room, gathering her parents and her beloved stuffed animals to reenact a story she had created. She called it The Day We Beat the Bear, a fictional tale of a family who faced a big, scary bear, but overcame it with love and bravery. Mark and Lisa watched with a mixture of pride and emotion as Ava stood proudly, narrating her story with dramatic gestures and a radiant smile. And then, she announced in her best, brave voice. They all stood together, even though the bear was super big and scary. And do you know what happened? The bear left them alone, because it saw how strong they were together. Lisa wiped away a tear, her heart swelling with pride and love. Mark clapped, cheering for his daughter as she took a dramatic bow. In that moment, he saw her strength in all its beautiful forms, a strength born from fear, but tempered with love, courage, and resilience. That night, as they tucked Ava into bed, she looked up at her parents, her eyes bright with a newfound confidence. "I'm not scared anymore," she whispered, her voice soft but steady, "because I know you'll always be there. And I'll always be there for you too." Mark felt a lump in his throat, but he managed to smile. "We'll always be there for each other, Ava. Always." As they left her room, Mark and Lisa held each other close, their hearts filled with gratitude. They had faced a darkness they never could have anticipated, a trial that had tested the very core of their family. But they had come through it stronger, more united than ever before. They had rediscovered the power of love, the strength of resilience, and the importance of facing fears together. And as they stood in the quiet of their home, they knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they were ready. Their love, their courage, and their faith in each other would guide them through anything. In the days, months, and years to come, they would always carry that memory, a reminder of a time when the darkness had tried to pull them apart, but had only brought them closer. Together, they were unstoppable, a family forged in love and resilience, a light that no shadow could ever extinguish.